Chapter 26 of The Red and the Black, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. The Red and the Black, Volume 1 by Stendhal. Translated by Horace B. Samuel. Chapter 26. The World, or What the Rich Lack. I am alone in the world. No one deigns to spare me a thought. All those whom I see make their fortune have an insolence and hardness of heart, which I do not feel in myself. They hate me by reason of kindness and good humour. Oh, I shall die soon, either from starvation, or the unhappiness of seeing men so hard of heart. Young. He hastened to brush his clothes and run down. He was late. Instead of trying to justify himself, Julien crossed his arms over his breast. Peccavi pater optime, I have sinned, I confess my fault, O my father, he said with a contrite air. This first speech was a great success. The clever ones among the seminarists saw that they had to deal with a man who knew something about the elements of the profession. The recreation hour arrived, and Julien saw that he was the object of general curiosity, but he only manifested reserved silence. Following the maxims he had laid down for himself, he considered his 321 comrades as enemies. The most dangerous of all in his eyes was the Abbé Pirard. A few days afterwards, Julien had to choose a confessor and was given a list. Great heavens, what do they take me for? He said to himself. Do they think I don't understand what's what? Then he chose the Abbé Pirard. This step proved decisive, without his suspecting it. A little seminarist, who was quite young and a native of Verrières, and who had declared himself his friend since the first day, informed him that he would probably have acted more prudently if he had chosen M. Castanede, the sub-director of the seminary. The Abbé Castanede is the enemy of Pirard, who is suspected of Jansenism, added the little seminarist in a whisper. All the first steps of our hero were, in spite of the prudence on which he plumed himself, as much mistakes as his choice of a confessor. Misled as he was by all the self-confidence of a man of imagination, he took his projects for facts, and believed that he was a consummate hypocrite. His folly went so far as to reproach himself for his success in this kind of weakness. Alas, it is my only weapon, he said to himself. At another period I should have earned my livelihood by eloquent deeds in the face of the enemy. Satisfied as he was with his own conduct, Julien looked around him. He found everywhere the appearance of the purest virtue. 8 or 10 seminarists lived in the odour of sanctity, and had visions like St. Teresa and St. Francis, when he received his stigmata on Mount Vernia in the Apennines. But it was a great secret, and their friends concealed it. These poor young people who had visions were always in the infirmary. 100 others combined an indefatigable application to a robust faith. They worked till they fell ill, but without learning much. 2 or 3 were distinguished by a real talent, amongst others a student of the name of Chazelle, but both they and Julien felt mutually unsympathetic. The rest of these 321 seminarists consisted exclusively of coarse persons, who were by no means sure of understanding the Latin words, which they kept on repeating the livelong day. Nearly all were the sons of peasants, and they preferred to gain their livelihood by reciting some Latin words than by ploughing the earth. It was after this examination of his colleagues that Julien, during the first few days, promised himself a speedy success. Intelligent people are needed in every service, he said to himself, for after all there is work to be done. I should have been a sergeant under Napoleon. I shall be a grand vicar among these future curés. All these poor devils, he added, manual labourers as they have been since their childhood, have lived on curded milk and black bread up till they arrived here. They would only eat meat 5 or 6 times a year in their hovels. Like the Roman soldiers who used to find war the time of rest, these poor peasants are enchanted with the delights of the seminary. Julien could never read anything in their gloomy eyes but the satisfaction of physical craving after dinner, and the expectation of sensual pleasure before the meal. Such were the people among whom Julien had to distinguish himself. But the fact which he did not know, and which they refrained from telling him, was that coming out first in the different courses of dogma, ecclesiastical history, etc., etc., which are taken at the seminary, constituted in their eyes neither more nor less than a splendid sin. Since the time of Voltaire and two-chamber government, which is at bottom simply distrust and personal self-examination, and gives the popular mind that bad habit of being suspicious, the Church of France seems to have realized that books are its real enemies. It is the submissive heart which counts for everything in its eyes. It suspects, and rightly so, any success in studies, even sacred ones. What is to prevent a superior man from crossing over to the opposite side, like Sieyes or Gregory? The trembling Church clings on to the Pope as its one chance of safety. The Pope alone is in a position to attempt to paralyze all personal self-examination, and to make an impression by means of the pompous piety of his court ceremonial on the bored and morbid spirit of fashionable society. Julien, as he began to get some glimpse of these various truths, which are none the less in total contradiction to all the official pronouncements of any seminary, fell into a profound melancholy. He worked a great deal and rapidly succeeded in learning things which were extremely useful to a priest, extremely false in his own eyes, and devoid of the slightest interest for him. He felt there was nothing else to do. Am I then forgotten by the whole world, he thought. He did not know that M. Pirard had received and thrown into the fire several letters with the Dijon stamp, in which the most lively passion would pierce through the most formal conventionalism of style. This love seems to be fought by great attacks of remorse. All the better, thought the Abbé Pirard. At any rate, this lad has not loved an infidel woman. One day the Abbé Pirard opened a letter which seemed half blotted out by tears. It was an adieu for ever. At last, said the writer to Julien, heaven has granted me the grace of hating, not the author of my fall, but my fall itself. The sacrifice has been made, dear one, not without tears, as you see. The safety of those to whom I must devote my life, and whom you love so much, is the decisive factor. A just but terrible God will no longer see his way to avenge on them their mother's crimes. Adieu, Julien. Be just towards all men. The end of the letter was nearly entirely illegible. The writer gave an address at Dijon, but at the same time expressed the hope that Julien would not answer, or at any rate would employ language which a reformed woman could read without blushing. Julien's melancholy, aggravated by the mediocre nourishment which the contractor who gave dinners at 13 centimes per head supplied to the seminary, began to affect his health, when Fouquet suddenly appeared in his room one morning. I have been able to get in at last. I have duly been 5 times to Besançon in order to see you. Could never get in. I put someone by the door to watch. Why the devil don't you ever go out? It is a test which I have imposed on myself. I find you greatly changed, but here you are again. I have just learned from a couple of good 5-franc pieces that I was only a fool not to have offered them on my first journey. The conversation of the two friends went on forever. Julien changed colour when Fouquet said to him, "Do you know, by the by, that your pupil's mother has become positively devout?" And he began to talk in that off-hand manner which makes so singular an impression on the passionate soul, whose dearest interests are being destroyed without the speaker having the faintest suspicion of it. Yes, my friend, the most exalted devoutness. She is said to make pilgrimages, but to the eternal shame of the Abbé Maslon, who has played the spy so long on that poor Monsieur Chelon, Madame de Renal would have nothing to do with him. She goes to confession to Dijon or Besançon. She goes to Besançon, said Julien, flushing all over his forehead. Pretty often, said Fouquet, in a questioning manner. Have you got any constitutionnel on you? What do you say? Replied Fouquet. I am asking if you've got any constitutionnel, went on Julien, in the quietest tone imaginable. They cost 30 sous a number here. What? Exclaimed Fouquet. Liberals, even in the seminary? Poor France, he added, assuming the Abbé Maslon's hypocritical voice and the sugary tone. This visit would have made a deep impression on our hero if he had not been put on the track of an important discovery by some words addressed to him the following day by the little seminarist from Verrieres. Julien's conduct since he had been at the seminary had been nothing but a series of false steps. He began to make bitter fun of himself. In point of fact, the important actions in his life had been cleverly managed, but he was careless about details, and cleverness in a seminary consists in attention to details. Consequently, he had already the reputation among his comrades of being a strong-minded person. He had been betrayed by a number of little actions. He had been convicted in their eyes of this enormity. He thought and judged for himself, instead of blindly following authority and example. The Abbe Pirard had been no help to him. He had not spoken to him on a single occasion, apart from the confessional, and even there he listened more than he spoke. Matters would have been very different if he had chosen the Abbe Castanede. The moment that Julien realized his folly, he ceased to be bored. He wished to know the whole extent of the evil, and to effect this emerged a little from that haughty, obstinate silence with which he had scrupulously rebuffed his comrades. It was now that they took their revenge on him. His advances were welcomed by a contempt verging on derision. He realized that there had not been one single hour from the time of his entry into the seminary, particularly during recreation time, which had not resulted in affecting him one way or another, which had not increased the number of his enemies, or won for him the goodwill of some seminarist, who was either sincerely virtuous, or of a fibre slightly less coarse than that of the others. The evil to repair was infinite, and the task very difficult. Henceforth, Julien's attention was always on guard. The problem before him was to map out a new character for himself. The moving of his eyes, for example, occasioned him a great deal of trouble. It is with good reason that they are carried lowered in these places. How presumptuous I was at Verrieres, said Julien to himself. I thought I lived. I was only preparing for life. And here I am at last in the world such as I shall find it, until my part comes to an end, surrounded by real enemies. What immense difficulties, he added, are involved in keeping up this hypocrisy every single minute. It is enough to put the labours of Hercules into the shade. The Hercules of modern times is the Pope Sixtus Quintus, who deceived by his modesty 15 years on end 40 cardinals who had seen the liveliness and haughtiness of his whole youth. So knowledge is nothing here, he said to himself with disgust. Progress in doctrine, in sacred history, etc., only seem to count. Everything said on those subjects is only intended to entrap fools like me. Alas, my only merit consists in my rapid progress, and in the way in which I grasp all their nonsense. Do they really value those things at their true worth? Do they judge them like I do? And I have the stupidity to be proud of my quickness. The only result of my coming out top has been to give me inveterate enemies. Chazelle, who really knows more than I do, always throws some blunder in his compositions, which gets him put back to the 50th place. If he comes out first, it is only because he is absent-minded. Oh, how useful would one word, just one word of M. Pirard have been to me. As soon as Julien was disillusioned, the long exercises in ascetic piety, such as the attendances in the chapel 5 times a week, the intonation of hymns at the chapel of the Sacré-Cœur, etc., etc., which had previously seemed to him so deadly boring, became his most interesting opportunities for action. Thanks to a severe introspection, and above all by trying not to overdo his methods, Julien did not attempt at the outset to perform significant actions, that is to say, actions which are proof of a certain Christian perfection, like those seminarists who served as a model to the rest. Seminarists have a special way, even of eating a poached egg, which betokens progress in the devout life. The reader who smiles at this will perhaps be good enough to remember all the mistakes which the Abbe Delille made over the eating of an egg, when he was invited to breakfast with a lady of the court of Louis XVI. Julien first tried to arrive at the state of non-culpa, that is to say, the state of the young seminarist whose demeanour and manner of moving his arms, eyes, etc., while in fact without any trace of worldliness, do not yet indicate that the person is entirely absorbed by the conception of the other world, and the idea of the pure nothingness of this one. Julien incessantly found such phrases as these charcoaled on the walls of the corridors. What are 60 years of ordeals, balanced against an eternity of delights, or an eternity of boiling oil in hell? He despised them no longer. He realized that it was necessary to have them incessantly before his eyes. What am I going to do all my life, he said to himself. I shall sell to the faithful a place in heaven. How am I going to make that place visible to their eyes? By the difference between my appearance and that of a layman. After several months of absolutely unremitting application, Julien still had the appearance of thinking. The way in which he would move his eyes and hold his mouth did not betoken that implicit faith which is ready to believe everything and undergo everything, even at the cost of martyrdom. Julien saw with anger that he was surpassed in this by the coarsest peasants. There was good reason for their not appearing full of thought. What pains did he not take to acquire that facial expression of blindly fervent faith, which is found so frequently in the Italian convents, and of which Le Guerchin has left such perfect models in his church pictures for the benefit of us laymen. On feast days the seminarists were regaled with sausages and cabbage. Julien's table neighbours observed that he did not appreciate this happiness. That was looked upon as one of his paramount crimes. His comrades saw in this a most odious trait, and the most foolish hypocrisy. Nothing made him more enemies. Look at this bourgeois, look at this stuck-up person, they would say, who pretends to despise the best rations there are, sausages and cabbage. Shame on the villain. The haughty wretch, he is damned forever. Alas, these young peasants, who are my comrades, find their ignorance an immense advantage, Julien would exclaim in his moments of discouragement. The professor has not got to deliver them on their arrival at the seminary from that awful number of worldly ideas which I brought into it, and which they read on my face whatever I do. Julien watched with an attention bordering on envy the coarsest of the little peasants who arrived at the seminary. From the moment when they were made to doff their shabby jackets, to don the black robe, their education consisted of an immense and limitless respect for hard, liquid cash, as they say in Franche-Comté. That is the consecrated and heroic way of expressing the sublime idea of current money. These seminarists, like the heroes in Voltaire's novels, found their happiness in dining well. Julien discovered in nearly all of them an innate respect for the man who wears a suit of good cloth. This sentiment appreciates the distributive justice which is given us at our courts, at its value, or even above its true value. What can one gain, they would often repeat among themselves, by having a lawsuit with a big man? That is the expression current in the valleys of the Jura to express a rich man. One can judge of their respect for the richest entity of all, the government. Failure to smile deferentially at the mere name of Monsieur the Prefect is regarded as an imprudence in the eyes of the Franche-Comté peasant, and imprudence in poor people is quickly punished by lack of bread. After having been almost suffocated at first by his feeling of contempt, Julien eventually experienced a feeling of pity. It often happened that the fathers of most of his comrades would enter their hovel in winter evenings and fail to find there either bread, chestnuts, or potatoes. What is there astonishing then, Julien would say to himself, if in their eyes the happy man is in the first place the one who has just had a good dinner, and in the second place the one who possesses a good suit? My comrades have a lasting vocation. That is to say, they see in the ecclesiastical calling a long continuance of the happiness of dining well and having a warm suit. Julien happened to hear a young imaginative seminarist say to his companion, "Why shouldn't I become pope like Sixtus Quintus, who kept pigs?" "They only make Italians popes," answered his friend. "But they will certainly draw lots amongst us for the great vicarships, canonries, and perhaps bishoprics. Monsieur P, Bishop of Clon, is the son of a cooper, That's what my father is. One day, in the middle of a theology lesson, the Abbé Pirard summoned Julien to him. The young fellow was delighted to leave the dark moral atmosphere in which he had been plunged. Julien received from the director the same welcome which had frightened him so much on the first day of his entry. " Explain to me what is written on this playing card," he said, looking at him in a way calculated to make him sink into the earth. Julien read, " Amanda Binet of the Giraffe Café before 8 o'clock. Say you're from Genlis and my mother's cousin." Julien realized the immense danger. The spies of the Abbe Castanede had stolen the address. " I was trembling with fear the day I came here," he answered, looking at the Abbe Pirard's forehead, for he could not endure that terrible gaze. " Monsieur Chelan told me that this is a place of informers and mischief makers of all kinds, and that spying and tale-bearing by one comrade on another was encouraged by the authorities. Heaven wishes it to be so as to show life such as it is to the young priests, and fill them with disgust for the world and all its pomps." " And it's to me that you make these fine speeches," said the Abbe Pirard furiously. " You young villain." " My brothers used to beat me at Verrieres," answered Julien coldly, " when they had occasion to be jealous of me." " Indeed, indeed," exclaimed M. Pirard, almost beside himself. Julien went on with his story, without being in the least intimidated. " The day of my arrival at Besancon, I was hungry, and I entered a cafe. My spirit was full of revulsion for so profane a place, but I thought that my breakfast would cost me less than at an inn. A lady who seemed to be the mistress of the establishment took pity on my inexperience. " Besancon is full of bad characters," she said to me. " I fear something will happen to you, sir. If some mishap should occur to you, have recourse to me and send to my house before 8 o'clock. If the porters of the seminary refuse to execute your errand, say you are my cousin and a native of Genlis." " I will have all this chatter verified," exclaimed the Abbe Pirard, unable to stand still and walking about the room. " Back to the cell." The abbe followed Julien and locked him in. The latter immediately began to examine his trunk, at the bottom of which the fatal cards had been so carefully hidden. Nothing was missing in the trunk, but several things had been disarranged. Nevertheless, he had never been without the key. " What luck that, during the whole time of my blindness," said Julien to himself, " I never availed myself of the permission to go out that M. Castanede would offer me so frequently, with a kindness which I now understand. Perhaps I should have had the weakness to have changed my clothes and gone to see the fair Amanda, and then I should have been ruined." When they gave up hope of exploiting that piece of information for the accomplishment of his ruin, they had used it to inform against him. 2 hours afterwards, the director summoned him. " You did not lie," he said to him, with a less severe look, " but keeping an address like that is an indiscretion of a gravity which you are unable to realize. Unhappy child! It may perhaps do you harm in 10 years' time." End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of The Red and the Black, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Red and the Black, Volume 1, by Stendhal. Translated by Horace B. Samuel. Chapter 27. First Experience of Life. The present time, great God, is the ark of the Lord. Cursed be he who touches it. Diderot. The reader will kindly excuse us if we give very few clear and definite facts concerning this period of Julien's life. It is not that we lack facts, quite the contrary, but it may be that what he saw in the seminary is too black for the medium colour which the author has endeavoured to preserve throughout these pages. Those of our contemporaries who have suffered from certain things cannot remember them without a horror which paralyses every other pleasure, even that of reading a tale. Julien achieved scant success in his essays at hypocritical gestures. He experienced moments of disgust and even of complete discouragement. He was not a success, even in a vile career. The slightest help from outside would have sufficed to have given him heart again, for the difficulty to overcome was not very great, but he was alone, like a derelict ship in the middle of the ocean. "And when I do succeed," he would say to himself, "think of having to pass a whole lifetime in such awful company, gluttons who have no thought but for the large omelette which they will guzzle at dinner time, or persons like the Abbé Castanède, who finds no crime too black. They will attain power, but great heavens, at what cost? The will of man is powerful, I read it everywhere, but is it enough to overcome so great a disgust? The task of all the great men was easy by comparison. However terrible was the danger, they found it fine, and who can realise, except myself, the ugliness of my surroundings?" This moment was the most trying in his whole life. It would have been so easy for him to have enlisted in one of the fine regiments at the garrison of Besançon. He could have become a Latin master. He needed so little for his subsistence, but in that case no more career, no more future for his imagination. It was equivalent to death. Here is one of his sad days in detail. "I have so often presumed to congratulate myself on being different from the other young peasants. Well, I have lived enough to realise that difference engenders hate," he said to himself one morning. This great truth had just been borne in upon him by one of his most irritating failures. He had been working for 8 days at teaching a pupil who lived in an odour of sanctity. He used to go out with him into the courtyard and listen submissively to pieces of fatuity enough to send one to sleep standing. Suddenly the weather turned stormy. The thunder growled, and the holy pupil exclaimed, as he roughly pushed him away, "Listen! Everyone for himself in this world. I don't want to be burned by the thunder. God may strike you with lightning, like a blasphemer, like a Voltaire. I deserve to be drowned if I go to sleep during the storm," exclaimed Julien, with his teeth clenched with rage, and with his eyes opened towards the sky, now furrowed by the lightning. "Let us try the conquest of some other rogue." The bell rang for the Abbé Castanède's course of Sacred History. That day the Abbé Castanède was teaching those young peasants already so frightened by their father's hardships and poverty, that the government, that entity so terrible in their eyes, possessed no real and legitimate power except by virtue of the delegation of God's vicar on earth. "Render yourselves worthy, by the holiness of your life and by your obedience, of the benevolence of the Pope. Be like a stick in his hands," he added, "and you will obtain a superb position, where you will be far from all control, and enjoy the king's commands, a position from which you cannot be removed, and where 1/3 of the salary is paid by the government, while the faithful who are moulded by your preaching pay the other 2/3. Castanède stopped in the courtyard after he left the lesson room. "It is particularly appropriate to say of a curé," he said to the pupils who formed a ring round him, "that the place is worth as much as the man is worth. I myself have known parishes in the mountains where the surplice fees were worth more than that of many town livings. There was quite as much money, without counting the fat capons, the eggs, fresh butter, and 1,001 pleasant tea-tales, and there the curé is indisputably the first man. There is not a good meal to which he is not invited, fêted, etc. Castanede had scarcely gone back to his room before the pupils split up into knots. Julien did not form part of any of them. He was left out like a black sheep. He saw in every knot a pupil tossing a coin in the air, and if he managed to guess right in this game of heads or tails, his comrades would decide that he would soon have one of those fat livings. Anecdotes ensued. A certain young priest, who had scarcely been ordained a year, had given a tame rabbit to the maidservant of an old curé, and had succeeded in being asked to be his curate. In a few months afterwards, for the curé had quickly died, he had replaced him in that excellent living. Another had succeeded in getting himself designated as a successor to a very rich town living, by being present at all the meals of an old paralytic curé, and by dexterously carving his poultry. The seminarists, like all young people, exaggerated the effect of those little devices which have an element of originality and which strike the imagination. I must take part in these conversations, said Julien to himself. When they did not talk about sausages and good livings, the conversation ran on the worldly aspect of ecclesiastical doctrine, on the differences of bishops and prefects, of mayors and curés. Julien caught sight of the conception of a second God, but of a God who was much more formidable and much more powerful than the other one. That second God was the Pope. They said among themselves, in a low voice, however, and when they were quite sure that they would not be heard by Pirard, that the reason for the Pope not taking the trouble of nominating all the prefects and mayors of France was that he had entrusted that duty to the King of France, by entitling him a senior son of the Church. It was about this time that Julien thought he could exploit, for the benefit of his own reputation, his knowledge of de Maistre's book on the Pope. In point of fact, he did astonish his comrades, but it was only another misfortune. He displeased them by expounding their own opinions better than they could themselves. Chelon had acted as imprudently for Julien as he had for himself. He had given him the habit of reasoning correctly, and of not being put off by empty words, but he had neglected to tell him that this habit was a crime in the person of no importance, since every piece of logical reasoning is offensive. Julien's command of language added consequently a new crime to his score. By dint of thinking about him, his colleagues succeeded in expressing the horror with which he would inspire them by a single expression. They nicknamed him Martin Luther, particularly, they said, because of that infernal logic which makes him so proud. Several young seminarists had a fresher complexion than Julien, and could pass as better looking, but he had white hands, and was unable to conceal certain refined habits of personal cleanliness. This advantage proved a disadvantage in the gloomy house in which chance had cast him. These dirty peasants among whom he lived asserted that he had very abandoned morals. We fear that we may weary our reader by a narration of the 1001 misfortunes of our hero. The most vigorous of his comrades, for example, wanted to start the custom of beating him. He was obliged to arm himself with an iron compass, and to indicate, though by signs, that he would make use of it. Signs cannot figure in a spy's report to such good advantage as words. End of chapter 27.
Chapter 28 of The Red and the Black, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. The Red and the Black, Volume 1 by Stendhal. Translated by Horace B. Samuel. Chapter 28. A Procession. All hearts were moved. The presence of God seemed to have descended into these narrow Gothic streets that stretched in every direction and were sanded by the care of the faithful. Young. It was in vain that Julien pretended to be petty and stupid. He could not please, he was too different. Yet all these professors, he said to himself, are very clever people, men in 1,000. Why do they not like my humility? Only one seemed to take advantage of his readiness to believe everything, and apparently to swallow everything. This was the Abbé Chas Bernard, the director of the ceremonies of the cathedral, where for the last 15 years he had been given occasion to hope for a canonry. While waiting, he taught homiletics at the seminary. During the period of Julien's blindness, this class was one of those in which he most frequently came out top. The Abbé Chas had used this as an opportunity to manifest some friendship to him, and when the class broke up he would be glad to take him by the arm for some turns in the garden. What is he getting at? Julien would say to himself. He noticed with astonishment that, for hours on end, the abbé would talk to him about the ornaments possessed by the cathedral. It had 17 lace chasubles, besides the mourning vestments. A lot was hoped from the old wife of the Judge de Rubempré. This lady, who was 90 years of age, had kept for at least 70 years her wedding dress of superb Lyons material, embroidered with gold. Imagine, my friend, the Abbé Chas would say, stopping abruptly and staring with amazement, that this material keeps quite stiff. There is so much gold in it. It is generally thought in Besançon that the will of the judge's wife will result in the cathedral treasure being increased by more than 10 chasubles, without counting 4 or 5 capes for the great feast. I will go further, said the Abbé Chas, lowering his voice. I have reasons for thinking the judge's wife will leave us her magnificent silver gilt candlesticks, supposed to have been bought in Italy by Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, whose favourite minister was one of the good lady's ancestors. But what is the fellow getting at with all this old clothes business, thought Julien. These adroit preliminaries have been going on for centuries, and nothing comes of them. He must be very suspicious of me. He is cleverer than all the others, whose secret aim can be guessed so easily in a fortnight. I understand. He must have been suffering for 15 years from mortified ambition. Julien was summoned one evening in the middle of the fencing lesson to the Abbé Pirard, who said to him, "Tomorrow is the feast of Corpus Domini, the Fête Dieu. The Abbé Chas Bernard needs you to help him to decorate the cathedral. Go and obey." The Abbé Pirard called him back and added sympathetically, "It depends on you whether you will utilize the occasion to go into the town." "Incedo per ignes," answered Julien. "I have secret enemies." Julien went to the cathedral next morning with downcast eyes. The sight of the streets and the activity which was beginning to prevail in the town did him good. In all quarters they were extending the fronts of the houses for the procession. All the time that he had passed in the seminary seemed to him no more than a moment. His thoughts were of Vergy, and of the pretty Amanda whom he might perhaps meet, for her café was not very far off. He saw in the distance the Abbé Chas Bernard on the threshold of his beloved cathedral. He was a big man, with a jovial face and a frank air. Today he looked triumphant. "I was expecting you, my dear son," he cried, as soon as he saw Julien in the distance. "Be welcome. This day's duty will be protracted and arduous. Let us fortify ourselves by a first breakfast. We will have the second at 10 o'clock during High Mass." "I do not wish, sir," said Julien to him gravely, "to be alone for a single instant. Deign to observe," he added, showing him the clock over their heads, "that I have arrived at 1 minute to 5. "So those little rascals at the seminary frightened you? It is very good of you to think of them," said the abbe. "But is the road less beautiful because there are thorns in the hedges which border it? Travellers go on their way and leave the wicked thorns to wait in vain where they are. And now to work, my dear friend, to work." The abbe Chas was right in saying that the task would be arduous. There had been a great funeral ceremony at the cathedral the previous day. They had not been able to make any preparations. They had consequently only one morning for dressing all the Gothic pillars which constitute the 3 naves with a kind of red damask cloth ascending to a height of 30 feet. The bishop had fetched by mail 4 decorators from Paris, but these gentry were not able to do everything, and far from giving any encouragement to the clumsiness of the Besançon colleagues, they made it twice as great by making fun of them. Julien saw that he would have to climb the ladder himself. His agility served him in good stead. He undertook the direction of the decorators from town. The abbe Chas was delighted as he watched him flit from ladder to ladder. When all the pillars were dressed in damask, 5 enormous bouquets of feathers had to be placed on the great baldachin above the grand altar. A rich coping of gilded wood was supported by 8 big straight columns of Italian marble. But to reach the centre of the baldachin above the tabernacle involved walking over an old wooden cornice, which was 40 feet high and possibly worm-eaten. The sight of this difficult crossing had extinguished the gaiety of the Parisian decorators, which up till then had been so brilliant. They looked at it from down below, argued a great deal, but did not go up. Julien seized hold of the bouquets of feathers and climbed the ladder at a run. He placed it neatly on the crown-shaped ornament in the centre of the baldachin. When he came down the ladder again, the abbe Chas embraced him in his arms. "Optime!" exclaimed the good priest. "I will tell this to Monseigneur." Breakfast at 10 o'clock was very gay. The abbe Chas had never seen his church look so beautiful. "Dear disciple," he said to Julien, "my mother used to let out chairs in this venerable building, so I have been brought up in this great edifice. The terror of Robespierre ruined us. But when I was 8 years old, that was my age then, I used to serve masses in private houses, so you see I got my meals on mass days. Nobody could fold a chasuble better than I could, and I never cut the fringes. After the re-establishment of public worship by Napoleon, I had the good fortune to direct everything in this venerable metropolis. 5 times a year do my eyes see it adorned with these fine ornaments, but it has never been so resplendent, and the damask breadths have never been so well tied or so close to the pillars as they are today." "So he is going to tell me his secret at last," said Julien. "Now he is going to talk about himself. He is expanding." But nothing imprudent was said by the man, in spite of his evident exaltation. "All the same, he has worked a great deal," said Julien to himself. "He is happy. What a man! What an example for me! He really takes the cake." This was a vulgar phrase which he had learned from the old surgeon. As the Sanctus of High Mass sounded, Julien wanted to take a surplice to follow the bishop in the superb procession. "And the thieves, my friend, and the thieves!" exclaimed the abbe Chas. "Have you forgotten them? The procession will go out, but we will watch, will you and I. We shall be very lucky if we get off with the loss of a couple of ells of this fine lace which surrounds the base of the pillars. It is a gift of Madame de Rubempre. It comes from her great-grandfather, the famous count. It is made of real gold, my friend," added the abbe in a whisper, and with evident exaltation, "and all genuine. I entrust you with the watching of the north wing. Do not leave it. I will keep the south wing and the great nave for myself. Keep an eye on the confessional. It is there that the women accomplices of the thieves always spy. Look out for the moment when we turn our backs." As he finished speaking, a 11:45 struck. Immediately afterwards the sound of the great clock was heard. It rang a full peal. These full, solemn sounds affected Julien. His imagination was no longer turned to things earthly. The perfume of the incense and of the rose leaves thrown before the Holy Sacrament by little children disguised as St. John increased his exaltation. Logically, the grave sounds of the bell should only have recalled to Julien's mind the thought of the labour of 20 men paid 54 centimes each, and possibly helped by 15 or 20 faithful souls. Logically, he ought to have thought of the wear and tear of the cords, and of the framework, and of the danger of the clock itself, which falls down every 2 centuries, and to have considered the means of diminishing the salary of the bell-ringers, or of paying them by some indulgence or other grace dispensed from the treasures of the church, without diminishing its purse. Julien's soul, exalted by these sounds, with all their virile fullness, instead of making these wise reflections, wandered in the realm of imagination. He will never turn out a good priest, or a good administrator. Souls which get thrilled so easily are at the best only capable of producing an artist. At this moment the presumption of Julien bursts out into full view. Perhaps 50 of his comrades in the seminary, made attentive to the realities of life by their own unpopularity, and the Jacobinism which they are taught to see hiding behind every hedge, would have had no other thought suggested by the great bell of the cathedral, except the wages of the ringers. They would have analysed with the genius of Balzac whether the intensity of the emotion produced among the public was worth the money which was given to the ringers. If Julien had only tried to think of the material interests of the cathedral, his imagination would have transcended its actual object, and thought of economizing 40 francs on the fabric, and have lost the opportunity of avoiding an expense of 25 centimes. While the procession slowly traversed Besançon on the finest day imaginable, and stopped at the brilliant altar stations put up by the authorities, the church remained in profound silence. There prevailed a semi-obscurity, an agreeable freshness. It was still perfumed with the fragrance of flowers and incense. The silence, the deep solitude, the freshness of the long naves sweetened Julien's reverie. He did not fear being troubled by the Abbé Chas, who was engaged in another part of the building. His soul had almost abandoned its mortal tenement, which was pacing slowly the north wing, which had been trusted to his surveillance. He was all the more tranquil when he had assured himself that there was no one in the confessional except some devout women. His eyes looked in front of him, seeing nothing. His reverie was almost broken by the sight of 2 well-dressed women, one in the confessional, and the other on a chair quite near her. He looked without seeing, but noticed, however, either by reason of some vague appreciation of his duties, or admiration for the aristocratic but simple dress of the ladies, that there was no priest in the confessional. It is singular, he thought, that if these fair ladies are devout, they are not kneeling before some altar, or that, if they are in society, they have not an advantageous position in the first row of some balcony. How well cut that dress is! How graceful! He slackened his pace to try and look at them. The lady who was kneeling in the confessional turned her head a little, hearing the noise of Julien's step in this solemn place. Suddenly she gave a loud cry and felt ill. As the lady collapsed and fell backwards on her knees, her friend who was near her hastened to help her. At the same time Julien saw the shoulders of the lady who was falling backwards. His eyes were struck by a twisted necklace of fine big pearls, which he knew well. What were his emotions when he recognized the hair of Madame de Renal? It was she! The lady who was trying to prevent her from falling was Madame Derville. Julien was beside himself and hastened to their side. Madame de Renal's fall would perhaps have carried her friend along with her, if Julien had not supported them. He saw the head of Madame de Renal, pale and entirely devoid of consciousness, floating on his shoulder. He helped Madame Derville to lean that charming head up against a straw chair. He knelt down. Madame Derville turned round and recognized him. " Away, monsieur, away," she said to him in a tone of the most lively anger. " Above all, do not let her see you again. The sight of you would be sure to horrify her. She was so happy before you came. Your conduct is atrocious. Flee. Take yourself off, if you have any shame left." These words were spoken with so much authority, and Julien felt so weak, that he did take himself off. " She always hated me," he said to himself, thinking of Madame Derville. At the same moment the nasal chanting of the first priest in the procession, which was now coming back, resounded in the church. The Abbé Charbernard called Julien, who at first did not hear him, several times. He came at last and took his arm behind a pillar, where Julien had taken refuge, more dead than alive. He wanted to present him to the bishop. " Are you feeling well, my child ?" said the abbé to him, seeing him so pale and almost incapable of walking. " You have worked too much." The abbé gave him his arm. " Come, sit down behind me here, on the little seat of the dispenser of holy water. I will hide you." They were now beside the main door. " Calm yourself. We have still a good 20 minutes before Monseigneur appears. Try and pull yourself together. I will lift you up when he passes, for in spite of my age I am strong and vigorous." Julien was trembling so violently when the bishop passed that the abbe Chas gave up the idea of presenting him. " Do not take it too much to heart," he said. " I will find another opportunity." The same evening he had 6 pounds of candles, which had been saved, he said, by Julien's carefulness, and by the promptness with which he had extinguished them, carried to the seminary chapel. Nothing could have been nearer the truth. The poor boy was extinguished himself. He had not had a single thought after meeting Madame de Renal. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Red and the Black, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole. The Red and the Black, Volume 1 by Stendhal. Translated by Horace B. Samuel. Chapter 29. The first promotion. He knew his age, he knew his department, and he is rich. The forerunner. Julien had not emerged from the deep reverie in which the episode in the cathedral had plunged him, when the severe Abbe Pirard summoned him. Monsieur the Abbe Charbernard has just written in your favour. I am on the whole sufficiently satisfied with your conduct. You are extremely imprudent and irresponsible without outward signs of it. However, up to the present, you have proved yourself possessed of a good and even generous heart. Your intellect is superior. Taking it all round, I see in you a spark which one must not neglect. I am on the point of leaving this house after 15 years of work. My crime is that I have left the seminarists to their free will, and that I have neither protected nor served that secret society of which you spoke to me at the confessional. I wish to do something for you before I leave. I would have done so 2 months earlier, for you deserve it, had it not been for the information laid against you, as the result of the finding in your trunk of Amanda Binet's address. I will make you New and Old Testament tutor. Julien was transported with gratitude, and evolved the idea of throwing himself on his knees and thanking God. He yielded to a truer impulse, and approaching the Abbe Pirard, took his hand and pressed it to his lips. " What is the meaning of this ?" exclaimed the director angrily, but Julien's eyes said even more than his act. The Abbe Pirard looked at him in astonishment, after the manner of a man who has long lost the habit of encountering refined emotions. The attention deceived the director. His voice altered. " Well, yes, my child, I am attached to you. Heaven knows that I have been so in spite of myself. I ought to show neither hate nor love to anyone. I see in you something which offends the vulgar. Jealousy and calumny will pursue you in whatever place Providence may place you. Your comrades will never behold you without hate, and if they pretend to like you, it will only be to betray you with greater certainty. For you there is only one remedy. Seek help only from God, who, to punish you for your presumption, has cursed you with the inevitable hatred of your comrades. Let your conduct be pure. That is the only resource which I can see for you. If you love truth with an irresistible embrace, your enemies will sooner or later be confounded." It had been so long since Julien had heard a friendly voice that he must be forgiven a weakness. He burst out into tears. The Abbe Pirard held out his arms to him. This moment was very sweet to both of them. Julien was mad with joy. This promotion was the first which he had obtained. The advantages were immense. To realize them, one must have been condemned to pass months on end without an instant's solitude, and in immediate contact with comrades who are at the best importunate, and for the most part insupportable. Their cries alone would have sufficed to disorganize a delicate constitution. The noise and joy of these peasants well fed and well clothed as they were, could only find a vent for itself, or believe in its own completeness, when they were shouting with all the strength of their lungs. Now Julien dined alone, or nearly an hour later than the other seminarists. He had a key of the garden, and could walk in it when no one else was there. Julien was astonished to perceive that he was now hated less. He, on the contrary, had been expecting that their hate would become twice as intense. That secret desire of his that he should not be spoken to, which had been only too manifest before, and had earned him so many enemies, was no longer looked upon as a sign of ridiculous haughtiness. It became, in the eyes of the coarse beings who surrounded him, a just appreciation of his own dignity. The hatred of him sensibly diminished, above all among the youngest of his comrades, who were now his pupils, and whom he treated with much politeness. Gradually he obtained his own following. It became looked upon as bad form to call him Martin Luther. But what is the good of enumerating his friends and his enemies? The whole business is squalid, and all the more squalid in proportion to the truth of the picture. And yet the clergy supply the only teachers of morals which the people have. What would happen to the people without them? Will the paper ever replace the cure? Since Julien's new dignity, the director of the seminary made a point of never speaking to him without witnesses. These tactics were prudent, both for the master and for the pupil. But above all, it was meant for a test. The invariable principle of that severe Jansenist Pirard was this: if a man has merit in your eyes, put obstacles in the way of all he desires, and of everything which he undertakes. If the merit is real, he will manage to overthrow or get round those obstacles. It was the hunting season. It had occurred to Fouquet to send a stag and a boar to the seminary, as though they came from Julien's parents. The dead animals were put down on the floor between the kitchen and the refectory. It was there that they were seen by all the seminarists on their way to dinner. They constituted a great attraction for their curiosity. The boar, dead though it was, made the youngest ones feel frightened. They touched its tusks. They talked of nothing else for a whole week. This gift, which raised Julien's family to the level of that class of society which deserves respect, struck a deadly blow at all jealousy. He enjoyed a superiority consecrated by fortune. Chazelle, the most distinguished of the seminarists, made advances to him, and always reproached him for not having previously apprised them of his parents' position, and had thus involved them in treating money without sufficient respect. A conscription took place, from which Julien, in his capacity as seminarist, was exempt. This circumstance affected him profoundly. So there is just passed forever that moment which 20 years earlier would have seen my heroic life begin. He was walking alone in the seminary garden. He heard the masons who were walling up the cloister walls talking between themselves. Yes, we must go. There's the new conscription. When the other was alive, it was good business. A mason could become an officer then, could become a general then. One has seen such things. You go and see now. It's only the ragamuffins who leave for the army. Anyone who has anything stays in the country here. The man who is born wretched stays wretched, and there you are. I say, is it true what they say, that the other is dead? Put in the third mason. Oh well, it's the big men who say that, you see. The other one made them afraid. What a difference! How the fortification went ahead in his own time! And to think of his being betrayed by his own marshals. This conversation consoled Julien a little. As he went away, he repeated with a sigh, Le seul roi dont le peuple a garde la mémoire. The time for the examination arrived. Julien answered brilliantly. He saw that Chazelle endeavoured to exhibit all his knowledge. On the first day, the examiners, nominated by the famous Grand Vicar de Frilair, were very irritated at always having to put first, or at any rate second on their list, that Julien Sorel, who had been designated to them as the Benjamin of the Abbe Pirard. There were bets in the seminary that Julien would come out first in the final list of the examination, a privilege which carried with it the honour of dining with my Lord Bishop. But at the end of a sitting dealing with the fathers of the Church, an adroit examiner, having first interrogated Julien on St. Jerome and his passion for Cicero, went on to speak about Horace, Virgil, and other profane authors. Julien had learnt by heart a great number of passages from these authors without his comrade's knowledge. Swept away by his successes, he forgot the place where he was, and recited in paraphrase with spirit several odes of Horace at the repeated request of the examiner. Having for 20 minutes given him enough rope to hang himself, the examiner changed his expression and bitterly reproached him for the time he had wasted on these profane studies and the useless or criminal ideas which he had got into his head. "I am a fool, sir, you are right," said Julien modestly, realizing the adroit stratagem of which he was the victim. This examiner's dodge was considered dirty, even at the seminary, but this did not prevent the Abbe de Frilair, that adroit individual who had so cleverly organized the machinery of the Besancon congregation, and whose dispatches to Paris put fear into the hearts of judges, prefect, and even the generals of the garrison, from placing with his powerful hand the number 198 against Julien's name. He enjoyed subjecting his enemy Pirard the Jansenist to this mortification. His chief object for the last 10 years had been to deprive him of the headship of the seminary. The abbe, who had himself followed the plan which he had indicated to Julien, was sincere, pious, devoted to his duties, and devoid of intrigue. But heaven in its anger had given him that bilious temperament which is by nature so deeply sensitive to insults and to hate. None of the insults which were addressed to him was wasted on his burning soul. He would have handed in his resignation 100 times over, but he believed that he was useful in the place where Providence had set him. "I prevent the progress of Jesuitism and idolatry," he said to himself. At the time of the examinations, it was perhaps nearly 2 months since he had spoken to Julien, and nevertheless he was ill for 8 days. When on receipt of the official letter announcing the result of the competition, he saw the number 198 placed beside the name of that pupil whom he regarded as the glory of his town. This stern character found his only consolation in concentrating all his surveillance on Julien. He was delighted that he discovered in him neither anger nor vindictiveness nor discouragement. Julien felt a thrill some months afterwards when he received a letter. It bore the Paris postmark. Madame de Renal is remembering her promises at last, he thought. A gentleman who signed himself Paul Sorel, and who said that he was his relative, sent him a letter of credit for 500 francs. The writer went on to add that if Julien went on to study successfully the good Latin authors, a similar sum would be sent to him every year. "It is she. It is her kindness," said Julien to himself, feeling quite overcome. "She wishes to console me. But why not a single word of affection?" He was making a mistake in regard to this letter, for Madame de Renal, under the influence of her friend, Madame Derville, was abandoning herself absolutely to profound remorse. She would often think, in spite of herself, of that singular being, the meeting with whom had revolutionized her life, but she carefully refrained from writing to him. If we were to talk the terminology of the seminary, we would be able to recognize a miracle in the sending of these 500 francs, and to say that heaven was making use of M. de Frilair himself in order to give this gift to Julien. 12 years previously, the Abbe de Frilair had arrived in Besancon with an extremely exiguous portmanteau, which, according to the story, contained all his fortune. He was now one of the richest proprietors of the department. In the course of his prosperity, he had bought the 1/2 of an estate, while the other half had been inherited by M. de la Mole. Consequently, there was a great lawsuit between these two personages. M. le Marquis de la Mole felt that in spite of his brilliant life at Paris and the offices which he held at court, it would be dangerous to fight at Besancon against the Grand Vicar, who was reputed to make and unmake prefects. Instead of soliciting a present of 50,000 francs, which could have been smuggled into the budget under some name or other, and of throwing up this miserable lawsuit with the Abbe Frilair over a matter of 50,000 francs, the Marquis lost his temper. He thought he was in the right, absolutely in the right. Moreover, if one is permitted to say so, who is the judge who has not got a son, or at any rate a cousin, to push in the world? In order to enlighten the blindest minds, the Abbe de Frilair took the carriage of my lord the bishop, 8 days after the first decree which he obtained, and went himself to convey the cross of the Legion of Honour to his advocate. M. de la Mole, a little dumbfounded at the demeanour of the other side, and appreciating also that his own advocates were slackening their efforts, asked advice of the Abbe Chelon, who put him in communication with M. Pirard. At the period of our story, the relations between these two men had lasted for several years. The Abbe Pirard imported into this affair his characteristic passion. Being in constant touch with the Marquis's advocates, he studied his case, and finding it just, he became quite openly the solicitor of M. de la Mole against the all-powerful Grand Vicar. The latter felt outraged by such insolence, and on the part of a little Jansenist into the bargain. See what this court nobility, who pretend to be so powerful, really are, would say the Abbe de Frilair to his intimates. Monsieur de la Mole has not even sent a miserable cross to his agent at Besançon, and will let him be tamely turned out. None the less, so they write me, this noble peer never lets a week go by without going to show off his blue ribbon in the drawing-room of the Keeper of Seal, whoever it may be. In spite of all the energy of the Abbe Pirard, and although Monsieur de la Mole was always on the best of terms with the Minister of Justice, and above all with his officials, the best that he could achieve after 6 careful years was not to lose his lawsuit right out. Being as he was in ceaseless correspondence with the Abbe Pirard in connection with an affair in which they were both passionately interested, the Marquis came to appreciate the Abbe's particular kind of intellect. Little by little, and in spite of the immense distance in their social positions, their correspondence assumed the tone of friendship. The Abbe Pirard told the Marquis that they wanted to heap insults upon him till he should be forced to hand in his resignation. In his anger against what, in his opinion, was the infamous stratagem employed against Julien, he narrated his history to the Marquis. Although extremely rich, this great lord was by no means miserly. He had never been able to prevail on the Abbe Pirard to accept even the reimbursement of the postal expenses occasioned by the lawsuit. He seized the opportunity of sending 500 francs to his favourite pupil. Monsieur de la Mole himself took the trouble of writing the covering letter. This gave the abbe food for thought. One day the latter received a little note, which requested him to go immediately on an urgent matter to an inn on the outskirts of Besançon. He found there the steward of Monsieur de la Mole. Monsieur le Marquis has instructed me to bring you his carriage, said the man to him. He hopes that after you have read this letter, you will find it convenient to leave for Paris in 4 or 5 days. I will employ the time in the meanwhile in asking you to be good enough to show me the estates of Monsieur le Marquis in the Franche-Comté, so that I can go over them. The letter was short. Rid yourself, my good sir, of all the chicanery of the provinces, and come and breathe the peaceful atmosphere of Paris. I send you my carriage, which has orders to await your decision for 4 days. I will await you myself at Paris until Tuesday. You only require to say so, monsieur, to accept in your own name one of the best livings in the environs of Paris. The richest of your future parishioners has never seen you, but is more devoted than you can possibly think. He is the Marquis de la Mole. Without having suspected it, the stern Abbe Pirard loved this seminary, peopled as it was by his enemies, but to which for the past 15 years he had devoted all his thoughts. Monsieur de la Mole's letter had the effect on him of the visit of the surgeon come to perform a difficult but necessary operation. His dismissal was certain. He made an appointment with the steward for 3 days later. For 48 hours he was in a fever of uncertainty. Finally he wrote to the Monsieur de la Mole and composed for my lord the bishop a letter, a masterpiece of ecclesiastical style, although it was a little long. It would have been difficult to have found more unimpeachable phrases, and ones breathing a more sincere respect. And nevertheless this letter, intended as it was to get Monsieur de Frilair into trouble with his patron, gave utterance to all the serious matters of complaint, and even descended to the little squalid intrigues, which, having been endured with resignation for 6 years, were forcing the Abbe Pirard to leave the diocese. They stole his firewood, they poisoned his dog, etc., etc. Having finished this letter, he had Julien called. Like all the other seminarists, he was sleeping at 8 o'clock in the evening. You know where the bishop's palace is, he said to him in good classical Latin. Take this letter to my lord. I will not hide from you that I am sending you into the midst of the wolves. Be all ears and eyes. Let there be no lies in your answers, but realize that the man questioning you will possibly experience a real joy in being able to hurt you. I am very pleased, my child, at being able to give you this experience before I leave you, for I do not hide from you that the letter which you are bearing is my resignation. Julien stood motionless. He loved the Abbe Pirard. It was in vain that Prudence said to him, after this honest man's departure, the Sacré-Cœur party will disgrace me, and perhaps expel me. He could not think of himself. He was embarrassed by a phrase which he was trying to turn in a polite way, but as a matter of fact he found himself without the brains to do so. Well, my friend, are you not going? Is it because they say, monsieur, answered Julien timidly, that you have put nothing on one side during your long administration? I have 600 francs. His tears prevented him from continuing. That also will be noticed, said the ex-director of the seminary coldly. Go to the palace. It is getting late." Chance would so have it that on that evening the Abbé de Frilair was on duty in the salon of the palace. My lord was standing with the prefect, so it was to M. de Frilair himself that Julien, though he did not know it, handed the letter. Julien was astonished to see this abbe boldly open the letter, which was addressed to the bishop. The face of the Grand Vicar soon expressed surprise, tinged with a lively pleasure, and became twice as grave as before. Julien, struck with his good appearance, found time to scrutinize him while he was reading. This face would have possessed more dignity had it not been for the extreme subtlety which appeared in some features, and would have gone to the fact of actually denoting falseness if the possessor of this fine countenance had ceased to school it for a single minute. The very prominent nose formed a perfectly straight line, and unfortunately gave to an otherwise distinguished profile a curious resemblance to the physiognomy of a fox. Otherwise this abbe, who appeared so engrossed with M. Pirard's resignation, was dressed with an elegance which Julien had never seen before in any priest, and which pleased him exceedingly. It was only later that Julien knew in what the special talent of the Abbé de Frilair really consisted. He knew how to amuse his bishop, an amiable old man made for Paris life, and who looked upon Besançon as exile. This bishop had very bad sight and was passionately fond of fish. The Abbé de Frilair used to take the bones out of the fish which was served to my lord. Julien looked silently at the abbe, who was rereading the resignation, when the door suddenly opened with a noise. A richly dressed lackey passed in rapidly. Julien had only time to turn round towards the door. He perceived a little old man wearing a pectoral cross. He prostrated himself. The bishop addressed a benevolent smile to him and passed on. The handsome abbe followed him, and Julien was left alone in the salon and was able to admire at his leisure its pious magnificence. The Bishop of Besançon, a man whose spirit had been tried but not broken by the long miseries of the emigration, was more than 75 years old and concerned himself infinitely little with what might happen in 10 years' time. "Who is that clever-looking seminarist I think I saw as I passed?" said the bishop. "Oughtn't they to be in bed according to my regulations? That one is very wide awake, I assure you, my lord, and he brings great news. It is the resignation of the only Jansenist residing in your diocese. That terrible Abbé Pirard realizes at last that we mean business." "Well," said the bishop with a laugh, "I challenge you to replace him with any man of equal worth. And to show you how much I prize that man, I will invite him to dinner for tomorrow." The Grand Vicar tried to slide in a few words concerning the choice of a successor. The prelate, who was little disposed to talk business, said to him, "Before we install the other, let us get to know a little of the circumstances under which the present one is going. Fetch me this seminarist. The truth is in the mouth of children." Julien was summoned. "I shall find myself between two inquisitors," he thought. He had never felt more courageous. At the moment when he entered, two valets, better dressed than M. Valenod himself, were undressing my lord. That prelate thought he ought to question Julien on his studies before questioning him about M. Pirard. He talked a little theology and was astonished. He soon came to the humanities, to Virgil, to Horace, to Cicero. It was those names, thought Julien, that earned me my number 198. I have nothing to lose. Let us try and shine. He succeeded. The prelate, who was an excellent humanist himself, was delighted. At the prefect's dinner, a young girl who was justly celebrated had recited the poem of the Madeleine. He was in the mood to talk literature, and very quickly forgot the Abbé Pirard and his affairs, to discuss with the seminarist whether Horace was rich or poor. The prelate quoted several odes, but sometimes his memory was sluggish, and then Julien would recite with modesty the whole ode. The fact which struck the bishop was that Julien never deviated from the conversational tone. He spoke his 20 or 30 Latin verses as though he had been speaking of what was taking place in his own seminary. They talked for a long time of Virgil or Cicero, and the prelate could not help complimenting the young seminarist. "You could not have studied better." "My lord," said Julien, "your seminary can offer you 197 much less unworthy of your high esteem." "How is that?" said the prelate, astonished by the number. "I can support by official proof just what I have had the honour of saying before my lord. I obtained the number 198 at the seminary's annual examination by giving accurate answers to the very questions which are earning me at the present moment my lord's approbation." "Ah, it is the Benjamin of the Abbé Pirard," said the bishop with a laugh, as he looked at M. de Frilair. "We should have been prepared for this, but it is fair fighting. Did you not have to be woken up, my friend," he said, addressing himself to Julien, " to be sent here?" " Yes, my lord. I have only been out of the seminary alone once in my life, to go and help Monsieur the Abbe Chas Bernard decorate the cathedral on Corpus Christi Day." " Optime," said the bishop. " So it is you who showed proof of so much courage by placing the bouquets of feathers on the baldachin. They make me shudder. They make me fear that they will cost some man his life. You will go far, my friend, but I do not wish to cut short your brilliant career by making you die of hunger." And by the order of the bishop, biscuits and wine were brought in, to which Julien did honour, and the Abbe de Frilair, who knew that his bishop liked to see people eat gaily and with a good appetite, even greater honour. The prelate, more and more satisfied with the end of his evening, talked for a moment of ecclesiastical history. He saw that Julien did not understand. The prelate passed on to the moral condition of the Roman Empire under the system of the Emperor Constantine. The end of paganism had been accompanied by that state of anxiety and of doubt which afflicts sad and jaded spirits in the 19th century. My lord noticed Julien's ignorance of almost the very name of Tacitus. To the astonishment of the prelate, Julien answered frankly that the author was not to be found in the seminary library. " I am truly very glad," said the bishop gaily. " You relieve me of an embarrassment. I have been trying for the last 5 minutes to find a way of thanking you for the charming evening which you have given me, in a way that I could certainly never have expected. I did not anticipate finding a teacher in a pupil in my seminary. Although the gift is not unduly canonical, I want to give you a Tacitus." The prelate had 8 volumes in a superior binding fetched for him, and insisted on writing himself on the title page of the first volume a Latin compliment to Julien Sorel. The bishop plumed himself on his fine Latinity. He finished by saying to him in a serious tone, which completely clashed with the rest of the conversation, " Young man, if you are good, you will have one day the best living in my diocese, and one not 100 leagues from my episcopal palace. But you must be good." Laden with his volumes, Julien left the palace in a state of great astonishment as midnight was striking. My lord had not said a word to him about the Abbe Pirard. Julien was particularly astonished by the bishop's extreme politeness. He had had no conception of such an urbanity in form, combined with so natural an air of dignity. Julien was especially struck by the contrast on seeing again the gloomy Abbe Pirard, who was impatiently awaiting him. " Quid tibi dixerunt? What have they said to you?" he cried out to him in a loud voice, as soon as he saw him in the distance. " Speak French, and repeat my lord's own words without either adding or subtracting anything," said the ex-director of the seminary in his harsh tone, and with his particularly inelegant manners, as Julien got slightly confused in translating into Latin the speeches of the bishop. " What a strange present on the part of the bishop to a young seminarist," he ventured to say, as he turned over the leaves of the superb Tacitus, whose gilt edges seemed to horrify him. 2 o'clock was already striking when he allowed his favourite pupil to retire to his room after an extremely detailed account. " Leave me the first volume of your Tacitus," he said to him. " Where is my Lord Bishop's compliment? This Latin line will serve as your lightning conductor in this house after my departure. Erit tibi, fili mi, successor meus tanquam leo querens quem devoret. For my successor will be to you, my son, like a ravening lion seeking someone to devour." The following morning Julien noticed a certain strangeness in the manner in which his comrade spoke to him. It only made him more reserved. This, he thought, is the result of M. Pirard's resignation. It is known over the whole house, and I pass for his favourite. There ought logically to be an insult in their demeanour. But he could not detect it. On the contrary, there was an absence of hate in the eyes of all those he met along the corridors. What is the meaning of this? It is doubtless a trap. Let us play a wary game. Finally the little seminarist said to him with a laugh, " Cornelii Taciti, opera omnia." Complete works of Taciti. On hearing these words, they all congratulated Julien enviously, not only on the magnificent present which he had received from my lord, but also on the 2 hours' conversation with which he had been honoured. They knew even its minutest details. From that moment envy ceased completely. They courted him basely. The Abbe Castanede, who had manifested towards him the most extreme insolence the very day before, came and took his arm and invited him to breakfast. By some fatality in Julien's character, while the insolence of these coarse creatures had occasioned him great pain, their baseness afforded him disgust, but no pleasure. Towards midday the Abbe Pirard took leave of his pupils, but not before addressing to them a severe admonition. "Do you wish for the honours of the world," he said to them, "for all the social advantages, for the pleasure of commanding pleasures, of setting the laws at defiance, and the pleasure of being insolent with impunity to all? Or do you wish for your eternal salvation? The most backward of you have only got to open your eyes to distinguish the true ways." He had scarcely left before the devotees of the Sacré-Cœur de Jésus went into the chapel to intone a Te Deum. Nobody in the seminary took the ex-director's admonition seriously. "He shows a great deal of temper because he is losing his job," was what was said in every quarter. Not a single seminarist was simple enough to believe in the voluntary resignation of a position which put him into such close touch with the big contractors. The Abbé Pirard went and established himself in the finest inn at Besançon, and making an excuse of business which he had not got, insisted on passing a couple of days there. The bishop had invited him to dinner, and in order to chaff his Grand Vicar de Frilair, endeavoured to make him shine. They were at dessert when the extraordinary intelligence arrived from Paris that the Abbé Pirard had been appointed to the magnificent living of N, 4 leagues from Paris. The good prelate congratulated him upon it. He saw in the whole affair a piece of good play, which put him in a good temper, and gave him the highest opinion of the Abbé's talents. He gave him a magnificent Latin certificate, and enjoined silence on the Abbé de Frilair, who was venturing to remonstrate. The same evening my lord conveyed his admiration to the Marquise de Rubempré. This was great news for fine Besançon society. They abandoned themselves to all kinds of conjectures over this extraordinary favour. They already saw the Abbé Pirard a bishop. The more subtle brains thought M. de la Mole was a minister, and indulged on this day in smiles at the imperious airs that M. the Abbé de Frilair adopted in society. The following day the Abbé Pirard was almost mobbed in the streets, and the tradesmen came to their shop doors when he went to solicit an interview with the judges who had to try the Marquise's lawsuit. For the first time in his life he was politely received by them. The stern Jansenist, indignant as he was with all that he saw, worked long with the advocates whom he had chosen for the Marquis de la Mole, and left for Paris. He was weak enough to tell 2 or 3 college friends who had accompanied him to the carriage whose armorial bearings they admired, that after having administered the seminary for 15 years, he was leaving Besançon with 520 francs of savings. His friends kissed him with tears in their eyes and said to each other, "The good abbé could have spared himself that lie. It is really too ridiculous." The vulgar, blinded as they are by the love of money, were constitutionally incapable of understanding that it was in his own sincerity that the Abbé Pirard had found the necessary strength to fight for 6 years against Marie Alacoque, the Sacré-Cœur de Jésus, the Jesuits, and his bishop. End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of The Red and the Black, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Red and the Black, by Stendhal. Translated by Horace B. Samuel. Chapter 30. An Ambitious Man. There is only one nobility, the title of Duke. A Marquis is ridiculous. The word Duke makes one turn around. Edinburgh Review. The Marquis de la Mole received the Abbé Pirard without any of those aristocratic mannerisms whose very politeness is at the same time so impertinent to one who understands them. It would have been a waste of time, and the Marquis was sufficiently expeditious in big affairs to have no time to lose. He had been intriguing for 6 months to get both the king and people to accept a minister who, as a matter of gratitude, was to make him a duke. The Marquis had been asking his Besançon advocate for years on end for a clear and precise summary of his Franche-Comté lawsuits. How could the celebrated advocate explain to him what he did not understand himself? The little square of paper which the abbé handed him explained the whole matter. "My dear abbé," said the Marquis to him, having got through in less than 5 minutes all polite formulae of personal questions. "My dear abbé, in the midst of my pretended prosperity, I lack the time to occupy myself seriously with 2 little matters which are rather important, my family and my affairs. I manage the fortune of my house on a large scale. I can carry it far. I manage my pleasures, and that is the first consideration in my eyes," he added, as he saw a look of astonishment in the Abbé Pirard's eyes. Although a man of common sense, the abbé was surprised to hear a man talk so frankly about his pleasures. "Work doubtless exists in Paris," continued the great lord, "but it is perched on the 5th story, and as soon as I take anyone up, he takes an apartment on the 2nd floor, and his wife starts a day at home. The result is no more work, and no more efforts except either to be, or to appear to be, a society man. That is the only thing they bother about, as soon as they have got their bread and butter. For my lawsuits, yes, for every single one of them, I have, to put it plainly, advocates who quarrel to death. One died of consumption the day before yesterday. Taking my business all around, would you believe, monsieur, that for 3 years I have given up all hope of finding a man who deigns, during the time he is acting as my clerk, to give a little serious thought to what he is doing. Besides, all this is only a preliminary. I respect you, and would venture to add that, although I only see you for the first time today, I like you. Will you be my secretary at a salary of 800 francs, or even double? I shall still be the gainer by it, I swear to you, and I will manage to reserve that fine living for you for the day when we shall no longer be able to agree." The abbé refused, but the genuine embarrassment in which he saw the Marquis suggested an idea to him towards the end of the conversation. "I have left in the depths of my seminary a poor young man who, if I mistake not, will be harshly persecuted. If he were only a simple monk, he would be already in pace. So far, this young man only knows Latin and the Holy Scriptures, but it is not impossible that he will one day exhibit great talent, either for preaching or for the guiding of souls. I do not know what he will do, but he has the sacred fire. He may go far. I thought of giving him to our bishop, if we had ever had one who was a little of your way of considering men and things." "What is your young man's extraction?" said the Marquis. "He is said to be the son of a carpenter in our mountains. I rather believe he is the natural son of some rich man. I have seen him receive an anonymous or pseudonymous letter with a bill for 500 francs. "Oh, it is Julien Sorel," said the Marquis. "How do you know his name?" said the abbé, in astonishment, reddening at his question. "That's what I'm not going to tell you," answered the Marquis. "Well," replied the abbé, "you might try making him your secretary. He has energy, he has a logical mind. In a word, it's worth trying." "Why not?" said the Marquis. "But would he be the kind of man to allow his palm to be greased by the prefect of police or anyone else, and then spy on me? That is only my objection." After hearing the favourable assurances of the Abbé Pirard, the Marquis took a 1,000-franc note. "Send this journey money to Julien Sorel. Let him come to me." "One sees at once," said the Abbé Pirard, "that you live in Paris. You do not know the tyranny which weighs us poor provincials down, and particularly those priests who are not friendly to the Jesuits. They will refuse to let Julien Sorel leave. They will manage to cloak themselves in the most clever excuses. They will answer me that he is ill, that his letters were lost in the post, etc., etc." "I will get a letter from the minister to the bishop one of these days," answered the Marquis. "I was forgetting to warn you of one thing," said the abbé. "This young man, though of low birth, has a high spirit. He will be of no use if you madden his pride. You will make him stupid." "That pleases me," said the Marquis. "I will make him my son's comrade. Will that be enough for you?" Some time afterwards, Julien received a letter, in an unknown writing, and bearing the Chlon postmark. He found in it a draft on a Besançon merchant, and instructions to present himself at Paris without delay. The letter was signed in a fictitious name, but Julien had felt a thrill in opening it. A leaf of a tree had fallen down at his feet. It was the agreed signal between himself and the Abbé Pirard. Within an hour's time Julien was summoned to the bishop's palace, where he found himself welcomed with a quite paternal benevolence. My lord quoted Horace, and at the same time complimented him very adroitly on the exalted destiny which awaited him in Paris, in such a way as to elicit an explanation by way of thanks. Julien was unable to say anything, simply because he did not know anything, and my lord showed him much consideration. One of the little priests in the bishopric wrote to the mayor, who hastened to bring in person a signed passport, where the name of the traveller had been left in blank. Before midnight of the same evening, Julien was at Fouquet's. His friend's shrewd mind was more astonished than pleased with the future which seemed to await his friend. "You will finish up," said that liberal voter, "with a place in the government, which will compel you to take some step which will be calumniated. It will only be by your own disgrace that I shall have news of you. Remember that, even from a financial standpoint, it is better to earn 100 louis in a good timber business, of which one is his own master, than to receive 4,000 francs from a government, even though it were that of King Solomon." Julien saw nothing in this except the pettiness of spirit of a country bourgeois. At last he was going to make an appearance in the theatre of great events. Everything was overshadowed in his eyes by the happiness of going to Paris, which he imagined to be populated by people of intellect, full of intrigues and full of hypocrisy, but as polite as the Bishop of Besançon and the Bishop of Agde. He represented to his friend that he was deprived of any free choice in the matter by the Abbé Pirard's letter. The following day he arrived at Verrières about noon. He felt the happiness of men, for he counted on seeing Madame de Rênal again. He went first to his protector, the good Abbé Chalin. He met with a severe welcome. "Do you think you are under any obligation to me?" said Monsieur Chalin to him, without answering his greeting. "You will take breakfast with me. During that time I will have a horse hired for you, and you will leave Verrières without seeing anyone." "Hearing is obeying," answered Julien, with a demeanour smacking of the seminary, and the only questions now discussed were theology and classical Latin. He mounted his horse, rode a league, and then perceiving a wood, and not seeing anyone who could notice him enter, he plunged into it. At sunset he sent away the horse. Later he entered the cottage of a peasant, who consented to sell him a ladder, and to follow him with it to the little wood which commands the Coeur de la Fidélité at Verrières. "I have been following a poor mutineer of a conscript, or a smuggler," said the peasant as he took leave of him. "But what does it matter? My ladder has been well paid for, and I myself have done a thing or two in that line." The night was very black. Towards 1 o'clock in the morning, Julien, laden with his ladder, entered Verrières. He descended as soon as he could into the bed of the stream, which is banked within 2 walls, and traverses M. de Rênal's magnificent gardens at a depth of 10 feet. Julien easily climbed up the ladder. "How will the watchdogs welcome me?" he thought. "It all turns on that." The dogs barked and galloped toward him, but he whistled softly, and they came and caressed him. Then, climbing from terrace to terrace, he easily managed, although all the grilles were shut, to get as far as the window of Madame de Rênal's bedroom, which, on the garden side, was only 8 or 6 feet above the ground. There was a little heart-shaped opening in the shutters, which Julien knew well. To his great disappointment, this little opening was not illuminated by the flare of a little night-light inside. "Good God," he said to himself, "this room is not occupied by Madame de Rênal. Where can she be sleeping? The family must be at Verrières, since I have found the dogs here. But I might meet Monsieur de Rênal himself, or even a stranger in this room without a light. And then what a scandal!" The most prudent course was to retreat, but this idea horrified Julien. "If it's a stranger, I will run away for all that I'm worth, and leave my ladder behind me. But if it is she, what a welcome awaits me! I can well imagine that she has fallen into a mood of penitence and the most exalted piety, but after all, she still has some remembrance of me, since she has written to me." This bit of reasoning decided him. With a beating heart, he resolved none the less to see her or perish in the attempt. He threw some pebbles against the shutter. No answer. He leaned his long ladder beside the window, and himself knocked on the shutter, at first softly, and then more strongly. "However dark it is, they may still shoot me," thought Julien. This idea made the mad adventure simply a question of bravery. "This room is not being slept in tonight," he thought, "or whatever person might be there would have woken up by now. So far as it is concerned, therefore, no further precautions are needed. I must only try not to be heard by the persons sleeping in the other rooms." He descended, placed his ladder against one of the shutters, climbed up again, and placing his hand through the heart-shaped opening, was fortunate enough to find pretty quickly the wire which is attached to the hook which closed the shutter. He pulled this wire. It was with an ineffable joy that he felt that the shutter was no longer held back, and yielded to his effort. I must open it bit by bit, and let her recognize my voice. He opened the shutter enough to pass his head through it, while he repeated in a low voice, "It's a friend." He pricked up his ears, and assured himself that nothing disturbed the profound silence of the room. But there could be no doubt about it. There was no light, even half extinguished, on the mantelpiece. It was a very bad sign. Look out for the gunshot, he reflected a little. Then he ventured to knock against the window with his finger. No answer. He knocked harder. I must finish it one way or another, even if I have to break the window. When he was knocking very hard, he thought he could catch a glimpse through the darkness of something like a white shadow that was crossing the room. At last, there was no doubt about it. He saw a shadow which appeared to advance with extreme slowness. Suddenly, he saw a cheek placed against the pane to which his eye was glued. He shuddered and went away a little. But the night was so black that he could not, even at this distance, distinguish if it were Madame de Renal. He was frightened of her crying out, at first in alarm. He heard the dogs prowling and growling at the foot of the ladder. "It is I," he repeated fairly loudly. "A friend." No answer. The white phantom had disappeared. "Deign to open to me. I must speak to you. I am too unhappy." And he knocked hard enough to break the pane. A crisp sound followed. The casement fastening of the window yielded. He pushed the casement, and leaped lightly into the room. The white phantom flitted away from him. He took hold of its arms. It was a woman. All his ideas of courage vanished. If it is she, what is she going to say? What were his emotions when a little cry gave him to understand that it was Madame de Renal? He clasped her in his arms. She trembled, and scarcely had the strength to push him away. "Unhappy man, what are you doing?" Her agonized voice could scarcely articulate the words. Julien thought that her voice rang with the most genuine indignation. "I have come to see you after a cruel separation of more than 14 months. Go away, leave me at once. Oh, Monsieur Chélan, why did you prevent me writing to him? I could then have foreseen this horror." She pushed him away with a truly extraordinary strength. "Heaven has deigned to enlighten me," she repeated in a broken voice. "Go away, flee. After 14 months of unhappiness, I shall certainly not leave you without a word. I want to know all you have done. Yes, I have loved you enough to deserve this confidence. I want to know everything." This authoritative tone dominated Madame de Renal's heart, in spite of herself. Julien, who was hugging her passionately and resisting her efforts to get loose, led off clasping her in his arms. This reassured Madame de Renal a little. "I will take away the ladder," he said, "to prevent it compromising us, in case some servant should be awakened by the noise, and go on a round." "Oh, leave me, she cried with an admirable anger. "What do men matter to me? It is God who sees the awful scene you are now making. You are abusing meanly the sentiments which I had for you, but have no longer. Do you hear, Monsieur Julien?" He took away the ladder very slowly, so as not to make a noise. "Is your husband in town, dear?" he said to her, not in order to defy her, but as a sheer matter of habit. "Don't talk to me like that, I beg you, or I will call my husband. I feel only too guilty in not having sent you away before." "I pity you," she said to him, trying to wound his, as she well knew, irritable pride. This refusal of all endearments, this abrupt way of breaking so tender a tie, which he thought still subsisted, carried the transport of Julien's love to the point of delirium. "What? Is it possible you do not love me?" he said to her, with one of those accents that come straight from the heart and impose a severe strain on the cold equanimity of the listener. She did not answer. As for him, he wept bitterly. In fact, he had no longer the strength to speak. "So, I am completely forgotten by the one being who ever loved me. What is the good of living on henceforth?" As soon as he had no longer to fear the danger of meeting a man, all his courage had left him. His heart now contained no emotion except that of love. He wept for a long time in silence. He took her hand. She tried to take it away, and after a few almost convulsive moments, surrendered it to him. It was extremely dark. They were both sitting on Madame de Rênal's bed. What a change from 14 months ago, thought Julien, and his tears redoubled. So absence is really bound to destroy all human sentiments. Deign to tell me what has happened to you, Julien said at last. My follies, answered Madame de Rênal, in a hard voice, whose frigid intonation contained in it a certain element of reproach, were no doubt known in the town when you left. Your conduct was so imprudent. Some time afterwards, when I was in despair, the venerable Chélan came to see me. He tried in vain for a long time to obtain a confession. One day he took me to that church at Dijon where I made my first communion. In that place he ventured to speak himself. Madame de Rênal was interrupted by her tears. What a moment of shame! I confessed everything. The good man was gracious enough not to overwhelm me with the weight of his indignation. He grieved with me. During that time I used to write letters to you every day, which I never ventured to send. I hid them carefully, and when I was more than unusually happy, I shut myself up in my room and read over my letters. At last, Monsieur Chélan induced me to hand them over to him. Some of them written a little more discreetly were sent to you. You never answered. I never received any letters from you, I swear. Great heavens! Who can have intercepted them? Imagine my grief until the day I saw you in the cathedral. I did not know if you were still alive. God granted me the grace of understanding how much I was sinning towards him, towards my children, towards my husband, went on Madame de Rênal. He never loved me in the way that I then thought that you had loved me. Julien rushed into her arms, as a matter of fact without any particular purpose, and feeling quite happy beside himself. But Madame de Rênal repelled him, and continued fairly firmly. My venerable friend Monsieur Chélan made me understand that in marrying I had plighted all my affections, even those which I did not then know, and which I had never felt before a certain fatal attachment. After the great sacrifice of the letters that were so dear to me, my life has flowed on, if not happily, at any rate calmly. Do not disturb it. Be a friend to me, my best friend. Julien covered her hand with kisses. She perceived he was still crying. Do not cry, you pain me so much. Tell me, in your turn, what have you been doing? Julien was unable to speak. I want to know the life you lead at the seminary, she repeated, and then you will go. Without thinking about what he was saying, Julien spoke of the numberless intrigues and jealousy which he had first encountered, and then of the great serenity of his life after he had been made a tutor. It was then, he added, that after a long silence which was no doubt intended to make me realize that I see only too clearly today that you no longer loved me, that I had become a matter of indifference to you. Madame de Rênal wrung her hands. It was then that you sent me the sum of 500 francs. Never, said Madame de Rênal. It was a letter stamped Paris and signed Paul Sorel, so as to avert suspicion. There was a little discussion about how the letter could possibly have originated. The psychological situation was altered. Without knowing it, Julien had abandoned his solemn tone. They were now once more on the footing of a tender affection. It was so dark that they did not see each other, but the tone of their voices was eloquent of everything. Julien clasped his arm round his lover's waist. This movement had its dangers. She tried to put Julien's arms away from her. At this juncture he cleverly diverted her attention by an interesting detail in his story. His arm was practically forgotten, and remained in its present position. After many conjectures as to the origin of the 500 francs letter, Julien took up his story. He regained a little of his self-control as he spoke of his past life, which, compared with what he was now experiencing, interested him so little. His attention was now concentrated on the final outcome of his visit. You will have to go, were the curt words he heard from time to time. What a disgrace for me if I am dismissed. My remorse will embitter all my life, he said to himself. She will never write to me. God knows when I shall come back to this part of the country. From this moment Julien's heart became rapidly oblivious of all the heavenly delights of his present position. seated as he was close to a woman who he adored, and practically clasping her in his arms in this room, the scene of his former happiness, amid a deep obscurity, seeing quite clearly as he did that she had just started crying, and feeling that she was sobbing from the heaving of her chest, he was unfortunate enough to turn into a cold diplomatist, nearly as cold as in those days when in the courtyard of the seminary he found himself the butt of some malicious joke on the part of one of his comrades, who was stronger than he was. Julien protracted his story by talking of his unhappy life since his departure from Verrières. So, said Madame de Rênal to herself, after a year's absence, and deprived almost entirely of all tokens of memory, while I myself was forgetting him, he only thought of the happy days that he had had in Verrières. Her sobs redoubled. Julien saw the success of his story. He realized that he must play his last card. He abruptly mentioned a letter he had received from Paris. I have taken leave of my Lord Bishop. What? You are not going back to Besançon? You are leaving us for ever? Yes, answered Julien resolutely. Yes, I am leaving a country where I have been forgotten even by the woman whom I loved more than anyone in my life. I am leaving it, and I shall never see it again. I am going to Paris. We're going to Paris, dear, exclaimed Madame Rênal. Her voice was almost choked by her tears, and showed the extremity of her trouble. Julien had need of this encouragement. He was on the point of executing a manoeuvre which might decide everything against him, and up to the time of this exclamation he could not tell what effect he was producing, as he was unable to see. He no longer hesitated. The fear of remorse gave him complete control over himself. He coldly added as he got up, Yes, madame, I leave you forever. May you be happy. Adieu. He moved some steps toward the window. He began to open it. Madame de Rênal rushed to him and threw herself into his arms. So it was in this way that, after a dialogue lasting 3 hours, Julien obtained what he desired so passionately during the first 2 hours. Madame de Rênal's return to her tender feelings, and this overshadowing of her remorse, would have been a divine happiness had they come a little earlier. But, as they had been obtained by artifice, they were simply a pleasure. Julien insisted on lighting the night-light, in spite of his mistress's opposition. Do you wish me then, he said to her, to have no recollection of having seen you? Is the love in those charming eyes to be lost to me for ever? Is the whiteness of that pretty hand to remain invisible? Remember that perhaps I am leaving you for a very long time. Madame de Rênal could refuse him nothing. His argument made her melt into tears. But the dawn was beginning to throw into sharp relief the outlines of the pine trees on the mountain east of Verrières. Instead of going away, Julien, drunk with pleasure, asked Madame de Rênal to let him pass the day in her room and leave the following night. And why not? She answered. This fatal relapse robs me of all my respect, and will mar all my life. And she pressed him to her heart. My husband is no longer the same. He has suspicions. He believes I led him the way I wanted in all this business, and shows great irritation against me. If he hears the slightest noise, I shall be ruined. He will hound me out like the unhappy woman that I am. Ah, here we have a phrase of M. Chalon's, said Julien. You would not have talked like that before my cruel departure to the seminary. In those days you used to love me. Julien was rewarded for the frigidity which he put into those words. He saw his love suddenly forget the danger which her husband's presence compelled her to run, in thinking of the much greater danger of seeing Julien doubt her love. The daylight grew rapidly brighter and vividly illuminated the room. Julien savoured once more all the deliciousness of pride, when he saw this charming woman in his arms, and almost at his feet, the only woman whom he had ever loved, and who had been entirely absorbed only a few hours before by her fear of a terrible God and her devotion to her duties. Resolutions, fortified by a year's persuasion, had failed to hold out against his courage. They soon heard a noise in the house. A matter that Madame de Rênal had not thought of began to trouble her. That wicked Eliza will come into the room. What are we to do with this enormous ladder? She said to her sweetheart. Where are we to hide it? I will take it to the loft, she exclaimed, suddenly, half playfully. But you will have to pass through the servants' room, said Julien in astonishment. I will leave the ladder in the corridor, and will call the servant and send him on an errand. Think of some explanation to have ready in the event of a servant passing the ladder and noticing it in the corridor." "Yes, my angel," said Madame de Rênal, giving him a kiss. "As for you, dear, remember to hide under the bed pretty quickly if Eliza enters here during my absence." Julien was astonished by this sudden gaiety. "So," he thought, "the approach of a real danger, instead of troubling her, gives her back her spirits before she forgets her remorse. Truly a superior woman. Yes, that's a heart over which it is glorious to reign." Julien was transported with delight. Madame de Rênal took the ladder, which was obviously too heavy for her. Julien went to her help. He was admiring that elegant figure, which was so far from betokening any strength, when she suddenly seized the ladder without assistance and took it up as if it had been a chair. She took it rapidly into the corridor of the third story, where she laid it alongside the wall. She called a servant, and in order to give him time to dress himself, went up into the dovecote. 5 minutes later, when she came back to the corridor, she found no signs of the ladder. What had happened to it? If Julien had been out of the house, she would not have minded the danger in the least. But supposing her husband were to see the ladder just now, the incident might be awful. Madame de Rênal ran all over the house. Madame de Rênal finally discovered the ladder under the roof, where the servant had carried it, and even hid it. What does it matter what happens in 24 hours, she thought, when Julien will be gone? She had a vague idea that she ought to take leave of life, but what mattered her duty? He was restored to her after a separation which she had thought eternal. She was seeing him again, and the efforts he had made to reach her showed the extent of his love. "What shall I say to my husband," she said to him, "if the servant tells him he found this ladder?" She was pensive for a moment. "They will need 24 hours to discover the peasant who sold it to you." And then she threw herself into Julien's arms and clasped him convulsively. "Oh, if only I could die like this," she cried, covering him with kisses. "But you mustn't die of starvation," she said with a smile. "Come, I will first hide you in Madame Derville's room, which is always locked." She went and watched at the other end of the corridor, and Julien ran in. "Mind you don't try and open if anyone knocks," she said, as she locked him in. "Anyway, it would only be a frolic of the children as they play together." "Get them to come into the garden under the window," said Julien, "so that I may have the pleasure of seeing them. Make them speak." "Yes, yes," cried Madame de Rênal to him, as she went away. She soon returned with oranges, biscuits, and a bottle of Malaga wine. She had not been able to steal any bread. "What is your husband doing?" said Julien. "He is writing out the figures of the bargains he is going to make with the peasants." But 8 o'clock had struck, and they were making a lot of noise in the house. If Madame de Rênal failed to put in an appearance, they would look for her all over the house. She was obliged to leave him. Soon she came back, in defiance of all prudence, bringing him a cup of coffee. She was frightened lest he should die of starvation. She managed after breakfast to bring the children under the window of Madame Derville's room. He thought they had grown a great deal, but they had begun to look common, or else his ideas had changed. Madame de Rênal spoke to them about Julien. The elder answered in an affectionate tone, and regretted his old tutor, but he found that the younger children had almost forgotten him. Monsieur de Rênal did not go out that morning. He was going up and downstairs incessantly engaged in bargaining with some peasants to whom he was selling potatoes. Madame de Rênal did not have an instant to give to her prisoner until dinner time. When the bell had been rung and dinner had been served, it occurred to her to steal a plate of warm soup for him. As she noiselessly approached the door of the room which he occupied, she found herself face to face with the servant who had hid the ladder in the morning. At the time he too was going noiselessly along the corridor, as though listening for something. The servant took himself off in some confusion. Madame de Rênal boldly entered Julien's room. The news of this encounter made him shudder. "You are frightened," she said to him, "but I would brave all the dangers in the world without flinching. There is only one thing I fear, and that is the moment when I shall be alone after you have left." And she left him and ran downstairs. "Ah," thought Julien ecstatically, "remorse is the only pang which this sublime soul is afraid of. At last evening came. Monsieur de Rênal went to the casino. His wife had given out that she was suffering from an awful headache. She went to her room, hastened to dismiss Eliza, and quickly got up in order to let Julien out. He was literally starving. Madame de Rênal went to the pantry to fetch some bread. Julien heard a loud cry. Madame de Rênal came back and told him that when she went to the dark pantry and got near the cupboard where they kept the bread, she had touched a woman's arm as she stretched out her hand. It was Eliza who had uttered the cry Julien had heard. What was she doing there? Stealing some sweets, or else spying on us, said Madame de Rênal, with complete indifference. But luckily I found a pie and a big loaf of bread. But what have you got there? Said Julien, pointing to the pockets of her apron. Madame de Rênal had forgotten that they had been filled with bread since dinner. Julien clasped her in his arms with the most lively passion. She had never seemed to him so beautiful. I could not meet a woman of greater character, even at Paris, he said confusedly to himself. She combined all the clumsiness of a woman who was but little accustomed to paying attentions of this kind, with all the genuine courage of a person who is only afraid of dangers of a quite different sphere and quite a different kind of awfulness. While Julien was enjoying his supper with a hearty appetite, and his sweetheart was rallying him on the simplicity of the meal, the door of the room was suddenly shaken violently. It was Monsieur de Rênal. "Why have you shut yourself in?" he cried to her. Julien had only just time to slip under the sofa. On any ordinary day, Madame de Rênal would have been upset by this question, which was put with true conjugal harshness, but she realized that Monsieur de Rênal had only to bend down a little to notice Julien, for Monsieur de Rênal had flung himself into the chair opposite the sofa which Julien had been sitting in 1 moment before. Her headache served as an excuse for everything. While her husband, on his side, went into a long-winded account of the billiards pool which he had won at the casino. Yes, to be sure, a 19-franc pool, he added. She noticed Julien's hat on a chair 3 paces in front of them. Her self-possession became twice as great. She began to undress, and rapidly passing 1 minute between her husband, threw her dress over the chair with the hat on it. At last Monsieur de Rênal left. She begged Julien to start over again his account of his life at the seminary. "I was not listening to you yesterday all the time you were speaking. I was only thinking of prevailing on myself to send you away." She was the personification of indiscretion. They talked very loud, and about 2 o'clock in the morning they were interrupted by a violent knock at the door. It was Monsieur de Rênal again. "Open quickly! There are thieves in the house," he said. "Saint Jean found their ladder this morning." "This is the end of everything," cried Madame de Rênal, throwing herself into Julien's arms. "He will kill both of us. He doesn't believe there are any thieves. I will die in your arms, and be more happy in my death than I ever was in my life." She made no attempt to answer her husband, who was beginning to lose his temper, but started kissing Julien passionately. "Save Stanislas' mother," he said to her with an imperious look. "I will jump down into the courtyard through the lavatory window, and escape into the garden. The dogs have recognized me. Make my clothes into a parcel, and throw them into the garden as soon as you can. In the meanwhile, let him break the door down. But above all, no confession. I forbid you to confess. It is better that he should suspect rather than be certain." "You will kill yourself as you jump," was her only answer, and her only anxiety. She went with him to the lavatory window. She then took sufficient time to hide his clothes. She finally opened the door to her husband, who was boiling with rage. He looked in the room and in the lavatory without saying a word, and disappeared. Julien's clothes were thrown down to him. He seized them, and ran rapidly toward the bottom of the garden, in the direction of the Doubs. As he was running, he heard a bullet whistle past him, and heard at the same time the report of a gun. "It is not Monsieur de Rênal," he thought. "He's far too bad a shot." The dogs ran silently at his side. The second shot apparently broke the paw of one dog, for he began to whine piteously. Julien jumped the wall of the terrace, did 50 paces under cover, and began to fly in another direction. He heard voices calling, and had a distinct view of his enemy, the servant, firing a gun. A farmer also began to shoot away from the other side of the garden. Julien had already reached the bank of the Doubs, where he dressed himself. An hour later he was a league from Verrières on the Geneva road. If they had suspicions, thought Julien, they will look for me on the Paris road. End of chapter 30. End of The Red and the Black, Volume 1. Translated by Horace B. Samuel.